Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our AGU, AGI Heads and Chairs webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about Eastern Washington University's policies for their field courses and field camp within the geology department. So we have three speakers from the university who are going to be telling us a little bit about what it is that they have been doing over the last few years to enable their students to have a safe field experience. Our three speakers are Chad Pritchard, Sharon Keach, who are both faculty members in the geology department, and joining them is Trent Luty, who is the vice president of business and auxiliary services on their campus. So with Chad, take it away.
All right, well, thank you very much, Pranoti, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Next slide, I guess, we'll just jump right into it. Thank you. And you can just kind of put those bullet points through. Is great. So this is just an overview of what we'll talk about. So I think the actual webinar is called Implementing Effective Field Camp Policies and Procedures. So what we'd like to do is just sort of give you an overview of what we do at Eastern Washington University. We'll use one field class called Geology 431 or Geol 431. And then our field camp is Geology 490. And we'll just kind of walk through the policies and how we talk to students and present those policies to the students. And the big take home for me, at least, it's really applicable because I have 3-year-old identical twin boys, is don't allow anybody time to idle or else bad things could happen. So then we'll go on to the next slide. So this is Eastern Washington University. This is a drone flight over the campus itself in fall. You can see the Palouse Hills in the background. And if you could go to the next, we'll go into the bullet points. So we're located in Cheney and Spokane, Washington, and Eastern Washington. Washington's a pretty big state, so a lot of people are familiar with UW as well, or University of Washington, which is on the west side in Seattle. Eastern Washington is primarily a teaching school. We're established in 1882 for teaching itself, and now we have about 13,000 students from multiple countries. A lot of our students are undergraduates and they're local. About half of our students are transfer, and about half of our students are also first generation, about 55%. The Department of Geology, there's the URL there, you can go visit. We have about 60 students in our department. We have 6 faculty, and we're undergraduate as well. We do have interdisciplinary masters here and there, but we have 6 faculty and then 2 instructors and 1 instructional technician who is quite a hoot. And then our website is down the bottom, an administrative assistant, of course. All right. Do you have anything to add about the department, Sharon?
No, I think, well, we can go on to the next slide here. So our summer field camps are senior capstone class students take at the end of their final year. Richard Orndorff here at EWU and myself developed our current field camp 14 years ago. Since then, the content as well as the policies have evolved as we continue to improve the class and develop and update the policies. But safety's always been a priority since the very first one. Can you, next? Actually, no, that works. The camp is 4 weeks in length and it's a 10-credit class since we're on the quarter system. And that's equivalent to 6 credits on the semester system. Each year we have at least 4 faculty teach the class, typically 2 for the first 2 weeks and 2 the second 2 weeks. That means we end up having a faculty to student ratio of roughly 1 to 10. And we designed it this way for both safety purposes and to maintain faculty interest in teaching the class over the long term. We go to the Cordillera Fold and Thrust Belt in Southwest Montana to do the class and stay on the University of Montana Western's campus in Dillon. Dillon provides a great central sort of location to our mapping areas, which are mostly within an hour's drive of campus. UMW does a really good job hosting us, as well as many other geology field camps that come from all over the country to take advantage of the beautifully exposed structural geology there, and that addition is unobscured by vegetation, which is helpful. For us, luckily, it's only a 5-hour drive from Cheney, Washington to Dillon. Typically, we have between 20 and 30 students attending the class, depending on the number of graduates for the year. It varies on a yearly basis, but on average, about half of the students are from EWU, and the other half are from colleges all over the country. We have a number of students that return from the same institutions year after year, including like Pacific Lutheran, Minot State, and Cal Lutheran, to name a few. I think we could go on to the next slide.
All right, and then for the example for a field class, our Geology 431 course is a structural geology too, but it's also as a field methods. So we do lectures during the week, mostly on restoration diagrams or cross sections, and then strain measurements. But then on Friday we go out in the field all week or all day for the most part. It's about a 5-hour field trip, and we usually can go within about 50 miles. In the background right there, we're in Bonnie Lake, in eastern Washington here, and in the middle is a Precambrian rock. It's folded, some isoclinal folds, and the students will canoe out there through this nice little wetland area and then go and map. And that would be a good example of one of our field trips. Other ones are not quite as fun as kayaking or canoeing, but they're still good. We'll usually have at least a weekend trip too, a Saturday trip up north, probably a couple 100 miles away, usually up to Colville, look at some fold and thrust structures, or sometimes Yakima. There's a lot of new data for the Yakima fold and thrust belt. And then, as I mentioned, there's the Bonnie Lake trip right there. And so these are sort of the situations where we have to get some risk assessment and know what we're doing for safety, especially, and how we get to a hospital. Most of the time for our field trips, we can just drive our department rig. There we can rent one from Carpool and take people there and know very clearly where the hospitals are. But for the Bonnie Lake, it's a little bit more planning associated with that. All right, so that's the example there. On to the next slide.
Is this
All right, this is Trent.
So risk management is something that we do not just for the geology field trips, but for international travel and for events on campus, and pretty much anything that we're going to do that's outside of normal operations, we want to do a risk assessment on. Each of the institutions that you're with should have a university risk manager. I don't know if you know who they are, but you might want to find out. And so when I get contacted by, in this case, the geology department, hey, we want to go to Dillon, Montana. We've done this for years. Then the risk manager starts to ask questions, because the risk manager functions from a perspective of always what if. And so the only way to know what if is if you tell us all of the details of the trip that you're planning. Go ahead and go to the next bullet, the next one after that, please. So the conduct code and the transportation are really sub-bullets of risk assessment. So the activity begins with the risk assessment, and that's when I ask the geology department, how are you going to get there? So there's the transportation piece. How many people are going? How many faculty are going? The faculty to student ratio is always important, because you don't want 30 students for one faculty member, because you set yourself up for a dangerous situation. Typically, we don't like it to have less than 2 faculty member, no matter how many students there are, because what if something happens? What if the faculty member gets hurt? Or what if a student gets hurt and the faculty member has to take that student to the hospital, and then there's no adult supervision left behind? So the faculty to student ratio, the transportation piece is also important, particularly for the state funded institutions, because if you're like Washington, academic programs of the institution are covered for insurance by the state general liability insurance policy. But transportation becomes an issue if you let people drive their POVs. And so you want to double check with the risk manager if you're planning on having students drive POVs, because typically that wouldn't be insured. Their primary, even if it's for official state business, then their personal insurance would be the primary insurance if there was anything to happen. The other part of risk assessment, particularly for Dillon, Montana, are critters, rattlesnakes and bees and all of those other sorts of things. And then the risk manager says, make sure all the students bring EpiPens if they are allergic. Make sure you have enough water. Make sure you have a plan if somebody gets bit by a rattlesnake, those types of things. So the risk assessment is where we look at the entire activity and look for potentials for things to go wrong. Then we get into the release form. We don't let students go on these trips without signing a release, a waiver that releases the institution from being held liable if a student gets hurt. Because I don't know about the other states, but at least for Washington State, and I think it's pretty much becoming nationwide, is that specificity is a key to an effective release form. So if you've been using a generic release form for a myriad of activities for many years, the Attorney General or your legal counsel might say, you know, we need to add some specificity. So for the geology trip to Dillon, we put in things like there are rattlesnakes and there are insects that could bite, that type of a thing. And so that the whole idea is that's informed consent. Just signing a generic release form is not sufficient. There are cases where an institution was sued for several $million and they lost because their risk form, the release form that they had done, did not specify certain dangers. And in fact, one of the students got bit by a critter and ended up with encephalitis. And there was nothing in the release form about those particular critters that could have bit them. So you create this release form, and we created an online form because of the different risks associated with all sorts of events, where the campus can go in there and they just basically tell us what the risks are in this online form, and then we use that information to build a customized release form for the activity. And the other things included in that are they assume the hazards and risks, they consent to treatment, they consent to a photo release and transportation, and then they sign that. If you have any students going who are minors, which we don't for this particular course because it's graduate level or upper, yeah. Then the parents have to sign the form. And for the Dillon, Montana one, because the risks are not minor, I mean, these are moderate risks and they could happen. So the risk for the institution is higher. So on those types of things, we'll typically require a wet signature from the parents or the students, as opposed to clicking a button online. You'd want to talk to your legal counsel or attorney general for that type of a thing. So the two components, again, you do the assessment, then you make sure that you have an assumption of risk, and then the risk manager helps if there are any additional insurance needs that might play into the event.
Nice. So on to the next slide, I think. And the specificity form is actually a huge help to us. Our Department of Geology policies used to be a lot more specific because in the past we used to have, I just have it right in front of me right now, it's about a 6-page form that has lots of signatures, a complete medical history of, not complete, but a pretty lengthy medical history of the student. And so the students would be glossy-eyed by the time they finish these 6 pages of sort of liability forms. But now with Trent's new form that we have now, which is like we enter the information online, we just get this 1 page. It's very concise, and there's also that photo release form, which is great for us, especially the day now with photos online. You know, like so Facebook and Instagram and all that good stuff. So here are the Department of Geology policies. We usually try to list them on the syllabus, and we'll go on to the next point here, and the next one. Oh man, why did I do that? Okay, you can go through all of them if you want. I just want to make sure we can see our wonderful students in the background for at least a couple seconds there. So we try to list a lot of these long ones on the syllabus itself, for any class, field camp or just even a class that has a field trip, where there's no smoking, alcohol is not permitted. We try not to vandalize any rocks around. We have some great outcrops in the Cheney area, and then Dillon is beautiful as well, and we don't want to ruin that for the future. Climbing is a huge issue. We have a lot of rock climbers here. We have a great EPIC group, which is our adventure group. And a lot of those guys end up being geology majors as well. And so every once in a while, I get people a little overzealous and want to rock climb, especially if we're in Moab or in Dillon. But we try to minimize that as much as possible because it's obviously, Trent's grabbing his head right now. We can't enter mine adits, and we want to make sure that everybody shows up on time so we don't lose anybody in the back. Anybody that does these things, after we've asked them not to, they can have dismissal from the course. and especially if there's fighting or sexual harassment and illegal drugs. And I can't make a joke about weapons. We can't have weapons in Washington. Anybody from Wyoming? I'm not sure. Okay, and then there's some other ones. The students, so they know that there are these specific issues that could happen while we're out there. We try to go through these policies to try to minimize what could happen, but we also try to put something in the syllabus that we can also add during the course itself, other rules, and just so we write that out so there's not a liability issue. And then as Trent had mentioned before, it's very important for us to say if you have asthma, bring an inhaler, or if you have allergies, bring like an EpiPen for that. And EpiPens can be really expensive, so it's kind of an issue. Specific for a field camp, which we'll go on to here, the dorm regulations for University of Montana Western are a little more stringent than our policies. And theirs is mostly because it's a dry campus, right? Did you talk about that?
No, not yet. It is dry and tobacco-free. So in Dillon, they particularly worry about the smoking issue, not just on campus, but in the field, because it's incredibly dry vegetation there in the summer. And summer fires are a common hazard there. So students are usually cognizant of this. We do also, even in their free time when they're expected to abide by UMW rules and regulations, and off campus, they're responsible, of course, for their own behavior. But we do remind them that even in their own time, they are representing our university, Eastern Washington University. And if they're sent home due to a violation of the rules, it's at their own expense. Can we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we've organized these safety protocols into 3 groups. The first are items that help maintain contact and, in addition, prevent getting lost. The second group are items that are aimed at minimizing safety issues. And then lastly, things we have in place just in case of an emergency. So let's start with the maintaining contact. You can't rely on cell service in remote field mapping areas, whether that's Dillon or here in sort of rural Eastern Washington or the Idaho Panhandle. So students carry a combined, for field camp anyway, we carry a combined radio /GPS. We use Garmin's, and EWU provides them with these. And then they carry also spare and charged batteries just in case. If all else fails for the technology, they are carrying a good old-fashioned whistle. A lot of backpacks have these now included as part of the bag. But if they're not, they're asked to wear one around their neck or tie it somewhere that's easily accessible. Also, we make sure that they know the international Morse code for SOS in case they actually have to use it. During the first week, we do a random whistle check in the field. They don't know it's coming, so just to make sure that they each have one and that it's accessible. They're all carrying topo maps, of course, for their mapping. So there's no doubt they can read those, even after the first few days, if they couldn't at the beginning of the class. So they should not technically get lost. In our large mapping areas, we ask the students maintain like visual contact with their group members at all times. And then the faculty and TAs, if we have some, are carry binoculars to try to keep track of groups from a high point in the mapping area. In addition to keep track of them, we also have the students check in with their GPS every hour. We just say to do it on the hour, which locates them for us on the GPS map. Other safety protocols to prepare or prevent possible issues include some advanced preparation that we ask of our students almost 6 months before field camp. First, to make sure they're physically fit for strenuous all-day activity. And for some, that might be starting a course of exercise. And then second, to start wearing in their field boots, especially if they're new. Too much sun is a common hazard during the summer there. Temperatures are frequently in the 80s and 90s, and we've had hotter. So we encourage students to carry several quarts of water at a minimum and to drink it. There are some other suggestions we make to, particularly around protection from sun, like covering up their skin, wide-brimmed hats, sunscreen, and so on. We do talk to them about leaving the wildlife alone, as Trent mentioned. Here in particular, it's the rattlesnakes. They're encouraged to make a noise while working, especially in the morning when the snakes are out warming up. Also, to prevent this, we ask that, well, they cannot play music in the field or keep their earbuds in their ears, and that's so that they can hear any warning rattle from the snakes. In case of an emergency, we leave vans in an established place with the keys, and the students know where the vehicle is going to be all day and where the keys are. In the vans, there's also an emergency med kit and an AED, an automated external defibrillator, which faculty have all been trained to use. We do also carry a substantial field med kit when we're away from the vans. Students are made aware of where the hospital is in case they ever have to drive there, which means not falling asleep on the way out to the field mapping area, so they know where they are. And then we also leave backup water in the vans, along with a battery charger, a tow kit, and a tire repair kit as well. I think, can we go on to the next slide?
I wanted to add one more thing on the emergency thing. I think one of the really important things is that faculty who are leading a trip like this, that they feel comfortable and they feel prepared to deal with what might ever happen. Usually they really are prepared for the medical emergency because that's what they think of first. One of the other things that they might want to do, though, is what am I going to do if there's a sexual assault or a complaint of a sexual assault? And so talking to your risk manager, or perhaps even better as the Title IX coordinator at the institution, hey, if something goes wrong out there, what do you want me to do? Because it happens, everybody knows it happens, and institutions can be held responsible under the law for how they deal with it. In fact, they are held responsible under the law for how they deal with it. And so if you're unclear of what should I do if a student comes up to me and said, hey, I was assaulted last night, have an idea, already know in advance, what am I going to do to deal with that? And then, so it's the sexual assault, medical emergency, and misbehaving students. Talk to the student, the dean of students, perhaps. What do I do if this happens? So have a plan in advance, and it'll be very beneficial if something like that does happen.
And just for the field trips themselves as well, I try to make sure everybody has my cell phone number, and I have everybody else's cell phone number too, so we can get in contact. Yeah, it doesn't always work out. Sometimes I get some weird texts from students, but it's helped in the field numerous times. So here's the next slide. How do we actually let the students know about these policies so they can be prepared themselves for what's happening? For our field camp, we have, as Sharon mentioned, a lot of our students are from other universities. And so before they can even enroll in our field camp, they have to fill out the assumptions form of risks and the agreement for that. When they sign up for the class, no matter what class here, we have our online software is Canvas. And so our syllabus is posted there. We hand out syllabi as well. And our policies are listed on that syllabus, or they are listed on that syllabus. At the first meeting, we usually try to cover each rule and regulation, talk about what could potentially happen on that field trip or what might happen in the class, and stress the fact that it might result in dismissal or failure of a course if you don't follow the rules and play safe. And then, of course, we'll also list all these rules and regulations out on a form, especially for field camp, and we'll go over it and have the students actually sign it so we know we've gone over it. They've been exposed to the code of conduct and all those things, but once they sign that at the very end, we know that they've actually been informed of the policies themselves. And on to the next slide. Again, my main policy is just keep the students engaged with class, keep them active, so that they're always learning something and doing something and not going off and getting lost, hopefully, or in best case, yeah. And so with that, I think we can all just say thank you for your time on the next slide right here. There's our contact information for myself, Chad, and then Sharon and Trent. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to questions. I think that's sort of the big thing that happens after these.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much to the three of you for your lovely presentation. We did have some questions roll in throughout your talk today. The first one is asking about if your field camp is open to your own students first, and then depending on how many slots are available, then do you open it up to other universities or departments, or how does that work?
Yes, that's exactly how we do it. So because of the number of graduates we have every year, we limit the number of external applicants to sort of fill the vans, essentially. So if there are 2 faculty going out for the first 2 weeks, then that means 20 students. And sometimes we've had nearly that in terms of our own graduates in a particular year, and so then we have TAs or additional faculty come out so that we'll reach the next threshold there of number of students would be 30. So yeah, it's exactly
Awesome.
what you said, yeah.
Okay, what are some of the disadvantages that you've faced with having students from outside of the university?
I would say it is, I mean, there are advantages and disadvantages in this, in that the students are coming to the class with different backgrounds. Yes, they're all, that more or less, most of them are in that senior year, but their field experiences have been very, very different. I think the biggest disadvantage would be that some students are unfamiliar with topographic maps. And of course, very rapidly they have to overcome that. So it becomes a bit of a steep learning curve in the first week for them. And the same thing with holding and using a Brunton. Some have never held them before. So it's because they're coming from a variety of sort of educational backgrounds that that is a slight disadvantage. I would say, though, that it also brings an advantage in that, they do have all these different backgrounds and come from different places around the country. So that's really nice for our students to mix and learn new things from them. And it always works out really well, getting the students to sort of integrate. So we're kind of conscious of making sure that in their groupings, in those first few field mapping exercises, that that we mix them up so they don't end up in Eastern cliques and then cliques from PLU. So, there are advantages to taking students from other colleges as well.
Yeah, of course. Now, what do you feel is an ideal student to faculty ratio?
So I typically it works out to be about 1 to 10, and 1 faculty member to 10 students, which seems reasonable, seems to work out. And sometimes with the addition of TAs, it becomes a little bit less even with.
Okay.
But again,
there was another question about how are you actually defining the faculty in this case, and do the TAs count as part of that 1 to 10 ratio?
So I was not including them in I was not including TAs in that 1 to 10 ratio that I mentioned. Those are faculty, hired within the department, within our department.
Okay, great. And this question goes back to your comments about weapons. There was a question about how are you defining weapons and what does that mean?
That actually might be a trend.
Really?
Is that,
I would, the one thing I don't know about the field trip, now on campus, and under Washington state law, the students are allowed to have a taser or mace.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and I mean, most of our students will have a pocket knife with them as far as weapons. I
Yeah.
guess in my mind, I was thinking firearms.
Yeah, I
Right.
would say no.
They're not allowed. Yeah,
No.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Now, how do you ensure due process for the accused if like a sexual harassment or some kind of assault allegation is made?
I'll go ahead and field
thank you,
this,
Jay.
and that's precisely why I said that it would be good to talk to the Title IX coordinator. And
Before, yeah.
and I'm assuming that Chad and Sharon have done that. No. So right, and you're right. It's really important because if you mess it up, you're going to get sued, or you could get sued. We have annual Title IX coordinator training or Title IX training. It is required. It is mandatory as of this year for every employee of the institution, and that includes student employees. And it's actually quite good training that we've contracted out through the Campus Clarity or Law Room, whatever their name is now. And it walks the employees through basically that. How do you respond to a sexual assault complaint?
Mm-hmm.
Identify it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have so many questions rolling in, so I'm just going to kind of go down the list. How are accommodations made for mobility and health disability?
That's a good question. So for field camp, yeah, there is a limitation there. And so usually what we'd end up doing for the capstone fulfillment, at least, would be to doing an independent research project. And we do have vans on campus where we can transport physically disabled people. And then as far as mental, that would be on a case by case.
Right. One of the things that Eastern does when we have a student who needs an accommodation for a disability, what will happen is it's actually an official process where the faculty member works with our disability support services. Disability support services helps the faculty understand what accommodations need to be made, makes recommendations on those.
Okay, excellent. And just a tidbit from me, if you are looking for other resources for bringing geoscientists who have disabilities out into the field, a great resource is the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. They're a nonprofit that basically specializes in just that, and they've run fully accessible field trips at some of our annual meetings in the Geosciences. So they're a fantastic resource. So I just thought I would throw that out there. One of the questions is actually looking at safety in the field, and it asks, do you require instructors to be certified in wilderness first aid?
We not specifically. All our faculty have done a first aid certification that included in the use of the AED. But outside of that, I think some of us informally have had that sort of training. In fact, I think probably most of us, being people, who spend a lot of time outdoors for not just for class but for fun. I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with those, although we have not asked faculty to maintain that particular certification.
Okay. Now, how do you balance consent for treatment, like asking in advance for information about their allergies and medical conditions, etc., and balancing that out with their privacy?
One of the things that we did is we removed that information from the previous form that we used.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't, they're adults for this particular field trip. They're all adults. And so we don't ask them for any medical information. What we do during the briefings and in the syllabus and whatnot is to remind them that they need to bring EpiPens and they need to, those types of things. But we also have in the assumption of risk form that if they have any medical conditions that they think could somehow impair their ability to complete the course requirements or complete the trip requirements, that they will inform the staff of those.
Okay.
And I don't know that you've had anybody do that.
Okay.
Very, very few, I think. Yeah. Yeah, that is a really good point, because our previous forms did have a pretty lengthy medical history, and I usually just had my students not fill it out because I don't want to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then if they do have an issue, just let me know.
Well, and if they did fill it out, then you've just created for yourself a record that you have to protect.
Mm-hmm. Right. That makes sense. Now, will any of your forms that you're talking about, will they be posted online for people to view?
Sure.
I believe there was a link to the risk management website that has, you can access the online form there to kind of initiate it. They won't be able to actually initiate it, will they, Trent?
Well, they could, but we don't want to create a bunch of risk release
Yeah.
forms for other
For other
institutions.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think we could work with our people to put this one up online through the Geology website, just so that people could see it.
Okay.
Sure.
As an example, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Now, how are the policies developed with the actual risk manager, and how likely is it that the risk manager states the risk outweighs the academic value of that exercise?
One of the main things with the idea of being the risk manager is that we don't say no unless we absolutely have to. The risk manager cannot eliminate risk from an activity. We mitigate the risk. And by having the release form and by talking to the faculty members about, hey, here's some things that you could do to prepare, and do you have water, and do you have the whistles, and those types of things, the faculty work with the risk manager to have a plan, to be prepared to respond, and with the assumption that something is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Do you have access to private property, and have landowners asked your students to sign the waivers as well? And
So,
if that does happen, like, do you have any examples of like the waivers and what that whole situation was?
So out in Southwest Montana, we are cognizant of staying out of privately owned property. So it's more or less all BLM or national forest. But I think maybe Chad has some examples.
Yeah, in our field class during the class itself, or during the academic year, normal academic year, we go often on our Friday field trips to private property. And in the past, we've had a lot of discussions about filling out a form for them. But our university, in this assumptions, brings in the fact that we have a pretty high liability insurance. And so most people, once they've read that form and contacted Trent's office, I've never actually gone through with having all students sign out a release of liability form for the
No, the main thing
site.
would be to have the permission of the landowner. I mean,
Yeah.
don't just show up.
And definitely, yeah, all of our field trips we call them. One specific one is an old 1904 tin tungsten mine on the South Hill, and we plan that out in advance, go out there, make sure we're very safe. We're in the field, and often they'll have one of the people that owns the property will come out and we say hi while we're there.
Nice. Okay,
Yeah.
That's awesome. Now, when you're out in the field, how do you deal with bad weather when that pops up? Do you have any common procedures and things that you do, or is it totally dependent on what the bad weather is?
Out in Southwest Montana, it's some of those summer convection storms that come in. I think in terms of weather. So we do ask that if they see that coming in, because we've got pretty good visibility in most of the mapping areas, and so if they see thunder and lightning and it's approaching, we actually get on the radios and we typically will call them in. If it's sort of a short-lived, you can see it's a very quick thing. It's get off the hills, put down any metal items, and, sort of play it by ear. If we are too far from the vans to, run back in the time. We do keep an eye on the weather all the time, because there are some sort of additional hazards in Dillon in particular there are some formations there that weather into bentonite, into clay essentially. And so if we see that there's going to be a substantial rain for a long term, that's going to go on for a while, we actually have to get out of the field, because we're going to get stuck in the mud if not.
Right.
So, yeah.
That would be terrible.
Yeah.
Lightning is usually the main caller. We'll call off a field trip. And then
yeah.
if it's just raining, we'll plug along.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah, and then, of course, we make sure as part of their equipment list is rain gear, right? It happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Switching gears a tiny bit, could you describe what like the food and the meal plan is, and if you have any dietary restrictions, how you handle those?
Okay, so UMW is responsible for feeding us. So that this is what I said, that they do a great job hosting. They have all kinds of options for different types of food allergies and food preferences. So, student really just has to say, here, I have this, I cannot eat this particular item. And they are always very good about making accommodations for that. So we eat all 3 meals, come from the campus. Students make their lunch, they pack their own lunch, and they have a lot of choices that they can make. We do that at sort of the end of breakfast, and so they have food then for the day and snacks, and then they make their own choices, and they're given a lot of different choices to recognize all the different sort of allergies and food preferences.
Great, fantastic. Now, if you do have someone who needs to be dismissed from the field course at the student's own expense, how do you facilitate that dismissal? An example could be like if the university would purchase a plane ticket to get that student to go, and then would that cost of that plane ticket be added to a student account or something like that? Do you have any processes or procedures to handle those kind of situations?
Thankfully, we've never had to dismiss anyone. We've had a couple of students who have who've left in the middle of camp for other reasons, and typically it's a Greyhound bus, or it's a friend coming to pick them up. We do have a number of students who drive to field camp in their own private vehicles, and then they just leave in those vehicles. I imagine they would if they needed to. So,
I think there was one person that somebody drove them up to Butte, Montana, and they flew out from there.
Okay.
The one time we had.
Okay.
When I was there.
Now, does your field camp include any off days? And if so, how do you manage those days?
So they do work 6 days a week in the field, and then on the 7th day is sort of their free time. I hesitate to say free time because often they are still working on maps, finishing up an assignment, transferring data from their field maps to final maps, doing laundry. So sort of going back to what Chad said before about keeping them busy, they're busy. Sometimes they will go on their own small trips, or just sort of recover from the week's strenuous sort of activities. In terms of managing that, we still say that they're still representing Eastern Washington University, so we want to be invited back to campus and still remain to go there, and we're pretty clear to them about that. So
they need to be on their best behaviors, of course.
Yeah, well, not necessarily best, but at least,
Yeah, respectful.
And
Absolutely.
they are still subject to the student conduct code.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So when you're out in the field, how much of the digital mapping technology does your university use?
We do have a field high precision GPS that we'll take out in the field. For the most part, we try to make them do a hand map drawn on a topo map, and then we'll also starting to do a lot more ArcGIS when we come back from the field. For the most part, I mean, once you can do it on the paper, then you understand the concept of layers, and then it's the fundamentals. Then the ArcGIS is the next component.
Okay, great. Going back to this idea about harassment and assault, when you're dealing with students from numerous different institutions, how do you merge the reporting for the harassment and assault? Because the different institutions might have different policies on the subject.
But yeah, they're enrolled in Eastern.
Yeah.
I mean,
They are enrolled in Eastern, but again, this would be something that you would discuss with the Title IX coordinator. I have seen some cases discussed as when I used to be involved with Title IX, where the institution would also be in contact with the host, with the student's regular institution, so make sure that they're aware. Probably, I would see two Title IX coordinators talking to each other on the phone to resolve that.
Okay, I see. I'm looking through the list here. Still thinking about emergency situations. In the listing of your emergency actions, you mentioned that the students know where the keys are to the vans. What policies do you have in place for when the students use the vans in that situation?
Okay, so it is sort of a hidden key, so nobody can just walk up from somewhere else and use it. When I've been out there, I've never, thankfully, I've been teaching the first 2 weeks for the last 14 years, and I haven't had an emergency while out in the field.
Knock on wood.
Yeah, I hesitate to say that, but I'd like to think it's because we got all the protocols in place, but I think the reality is there's been an element of luck.
Yeah. I've had a couple of situations where I TA'd at other universities and taught other universities. And in those situations, we try to get the faculty back to the van first. So one of the faculty member can drive the student to the hospital. The hospital is within walking distance of the university. So we can usually just make sure the student's checked in the hospital and then make sure they're okay. And then go back to the field to pick up the other students or continue the day.
Yeah. So I think the circumstances that have happened in Dillon, that it has been one of the faculty that have driven them to the hospital in Dillon.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we had a participant say that during his field camp, they actually allow their students to take the university vehicles unsupervised to travel to recreational spots for the day or for overnight. What are your feelings on that?
We say no.
Okay.
One of the things that, excluding the Dillon, Montana trip, when we have students out for long periods of time, in this case it's 4 weeks, if there's going to be a recreational type element to a travel, then we would have a designated responsible person, i.e. the faculty member says that, okay, I'll take a group of students downtown when you can hang out for a while, and then I'll pick you all up at a certain time.
Yeah, and I have taken groups. I haven't let the students actually drive the van for Eastern, but I'll take groups out to a different field site. You know, like there's some pre-Cambrian shatter cones. We'll go, go check that out for a day, a day off.
Okay. Nice. Kind of going back to emergency situations, it was noted that it's really interesting that you have your students know the Morse code for SOS. Has it ever been used? And have you ever had a failure on the radio or the GPS and had to depend on the whistle for Morse code?
I don't think we've actually had to use it in practice. It's sort of been a backup to a backup to a backup plan.
Okay. Yeah.
Sort of if everything else fails technology-wise. So we have had radios that have stopped working, or that particular individual forgot some spare batteries, but then we are keeping them in groups of either 2 or 3, and that sort of mitigates that if one has a radio that goes broke or gets lost or something, then they still have a radio contact. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And nowadays, with cell coverage is pretty good these days too. Even in Dillon, if you get up on top of the ridge, I've gotten lots of phone calls in the field for issues, and sometimes
That's impressive. Have you ever had a time when a faculty member was injured? And if that has happened, what did you guys or what did the students do?
Thankfully, we have not had that happen, at least in Dillon. So yeah, we have not had to deal with that. I think that's going back though to the faculty student to faculty ratio thing. If we've got several faculty in the field, then there's always somebody there that with the students.
Right.
I would still
Absolutely.
go out.
And to that end, particularly for international travel, study abroad activities, we don't allow less than 2 faculty member. Even if there's only 8 students, we require 2 faculty members.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Now, going back to your release forms, do you also include the next of kin contact information on those release forms?
No, it's listed as emergency contact.
Okay.
Contact number. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So
Great.
it's their
It is
choice
there.
then who they
Yeah.
fill in as
Yeah.
contact.
Okay. Yeah, it gives the students a little bit more control. What are your policies for checking out equipment, like the radios, etc., to the students with particular regard to the loss or damage of those items?
Yeah, and we do have them check it out. So there's a certain number to each of the pieces of equipment, and unfortunately, we have in the past had a couple times where students had to reimburse for equipment.
Okay. Gotcha. Now, going back to the international travel, how are your policies and protocols different for an international field campaign?
Study abroads are handled in a much different fashion. They require a lot greater timing, and we actually have an international group travel committee that reviews every study abroad and looks at it for academic value, looks at it for risk, and quite honestly, the faculty members have to do a lot more paperwork to request an international trip.
Okay. Going back to kind of some of the policies, in terms of health and safety, we have a participant that says that he copies the student's health insurance card. What are your perspectives on doing that?
We're actually looking at that right now for all of our activities, not just for example, the Dillon, Montana, in particular for the summer camps that are held here at Eastern. And so we, in the past, we've copied those things, and then we stopped and we thought, this just recently, why are we doing this? So we contacted the local medical clinics and asked if they required it. And the question being, is somebody going to refuse treatment because you don't have the medical insurance card? And that's not the case. And it actually becomes pretty problematic for people to actually gather those documents, especially for summer camps, because the people coming to the camps are from all over the place. So I think we're going to stop doing that for the summer camps. And of course, we'd stop doing that for any other types of activities. But we do request their insurance information, so that we can give it to the medical treatment facility if they end up in one.
Okay. Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you. That was actually our last question, but we have had questions continue to roll in. So giving a shout out to our very active participants of this webinar, which is fantastic. Are there any other last minute questions before we close the session with some finishing announcements? I'll give the participants another minute or so. And to our speakers, Chad, Sharon, and Trent, do you have any closing comments or remarks while we wait for our participants if they have any last questions?